subject of zoning emerged a few times. How would the zoning theory that's being put forward, Laura, would you be able to comment on the stamping in of this zoning policy into somewhere like Nottingham?
It's one of the things that worries me the most, actually. When we developed the design quality framework, we initially thought about it. We have an urban design guide which looks at the city centre, and there are some areas of character areas in the design guide, and we started by trying to map and trying to zone where is this going to apply, because we have different characters, but we couldn't make it work. We just could not zone, because every site, even within zones, every site is completely different to another. And if you have an approach of building in context, you can't make it work. How do you regulate a series of criteria that will apply up until this line? So the neighbor across the road will have one criteria and you have a different one. How do you make the place work as a coherent thing? We just simply could not adopt the zoning. And we also felt that zoning in that format, particularly saying here is where the regeneration area is and everything will be permitted and across the road isn't, it's actually quite a powerful way of balancing land values and investment and gentrification and a lot of other things. Because you're saying, right here, everybody can do whatever they like, and over there, no, you can't. So the whole property market will be completely manipulated by a drawing. We didn't have, in the end, we didn't go for zoning. We went for a different system. We could make it work without the zoning anyway. We went for the approach of building in context, which is the old-fashioned way of coming up with a design solution. That's my response to that. I don't see how to make it work. Now, I come from South America, and in South America, there's masses of land, flat, with absolutely nothing in it. So you can start from zero and you can say, okay, up to this line, it will be like that. And then we put a row of trees, and on the other side of the trees will be like that. But England is already, the UK is already too rich, and it has layers and layers and layers of history and social investment. You can't erase that by putting a stamp. So no, I don't know how to make that work, is my answer.
I think, as Laura said, I mean, the danger with zoning is that we will end up creating a planning system that's far more complex than the existing planning system, because it will have to somehow capture the complex character of different locations that already exist in an urban setting in particular. There is a very high degree of complexity that I can't see how it can be captured by zoning. And I'll give you an example. I mean, I won't talk too long. I was just thinking about this particular example of Shakespeare Street and Barton Street in the city centre of Nottingham, where you have, on that particular square there, you'd have the Guildhall, which is a Grade 2 listed building, sitting next to another Grade listed building, which is Nottingham Trent University's main building. And then you'd have the Eon high-rise next to it, which is a very modern building, kind of international style, like a glassy kind of thing. And you have some other 1920s structures towards Shakespeare Street there, which is the old fire station. So how do you zone that block? I mean, you simply can't zone it, because it has everything in it. It has renewal, it has regeneration, it has growth potentially. So we have to be very careful about how these different systems that come from America, probably, as many of the speakers suggested, are going to be applied in the UK. And so it's going to be very difficult to apply to the UK. I can't see how it's possible, at least on an urban setting.
Tell us what, for example, is the difference between what they describe as a protective zones and renewal zones?
Protected zones, I think what they're trying to do, they're trying to keep traditional development management as it is, and perhaps add a bit to it. And on renewal zones, there would be a mixture of planning applications and permitted development, which, it would be to some extent similar to the current system. And then there would be growth zones in which everything would be allowed, and then you could just build without planning application, without having to go through the planning application system. So it will be basically a free-for-all for developers to just develop what they want to develop, and they will be only held accountable by the pattern system, that's going to exist. But I think Jonathan wants to add something there.
I mean, the way we've read it is that whilst the principle of development will be agreed, there will still be the need to consider the appearance and character of the buildings or structures being erected, even in the growth zone. So whilst the principle will be accepted, and maybe even the quantum of development will have been agreed, the appearance and the relationship of the new structures to its surroundings will still be open to consideration. That's from our reading of it. But of course, this plays on the vagueness of the white paper, that none of us are particularly sure of what actually it will involve. But even in growth zones, the impression we have is that there will be the opportunity to consider the size, form and character of the buildings, even if the quantum of development and the principle has already been agreed through a local plan process.
Yes, yes, I wanted to make a little comment on that. And we are really struggling in Nottingham with the issue of testing how we look at the appearance of the building and how we improve facades, particularly when it's to do with building in context and near historic buildings and all of that. Because it's very difficult to manipulate a facade to make it an appearance that is what the system wants, when you're not looking at the building in its whole integrity. And this planning system is not suggesting that we should look at the layout and the energy performance and the response to site and the appearance as a whole. And as architects, we know that that's how buildings work. You can't just separate and put a facade. Yes, I'm going to paint your face green and you'll look better. It just doesn't work like that. So what we did in Nottingham is we started to do evaluations of layouts, which many developers are very shocked about that, because the planning system is not meant to do that. But we go and change the position of the corridors, and we suggest moving things around. But you can't see a facade without seeing the integrity of the building.
When outline planning permissions come up, a huge concern is the massing of buildings. And so designating something a growth zone. In Nottingham, we have some very historic vistas that we like to protect. For example, the views through to the council house in the middle of the market, the old market square, and the view of the escarpment that crosses across the southern part of the city centre as well. So there are, so a lot of the concern that's raised by members of the public, by the civic society, about the massing of buildings. And I think a good example of that is, for example, the new Unity Square building opposite the station. So there was a huge amount of concern originally in the original plans that went way too far up to the pavement and completely dominated over the lovely sort of Victorian restored railway station. Now, some people think that that's still the case, but within the planning process, that building was stepped back and reduced by several stories in order to ensure that it doesn't dwarf over in an awkward way over the Victorian railway station, that you would still have that view, that vista as you come round to the Victorian railway station. And so I think that is something that I don't see how views and historic, we're doing up the castle at the moment, and it's really important to us that the castle is, like the NCP car park to one side, but the actual views up to the castle are really important for Nottingham. And I don't know how you would actually protect a view if you have different zoning areas within a city.
Some of the comments have touched loosely upon the possibility of utilising technology or some kind of advanced learning systems to steer some of the decision making. Philip, in your conversations with anybody associated with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, did it ever emerge viable ideas about the successful utilisation of either machine learning or more advanced technologies in Was there any hint of how that might translate or examples where it's been utilised elsewhere? Was that presented in any capacity?
Discussions on technology really focused on accessibility of planning and the ability of communities and the public at large to access and view. So, for example, I don't know if people on this call have had this experience, but I receive from my local planning authority notes saying that due to COVID, we can't send our officers to site because it's too dangerous. So would you please go and put this notice up for us? And you know, you ask, why are we still putting notices up on telegraph poles when actually we could communicate more effectively using technological means? And why does my health not matter, but others do? But I think the other thing that you know, we as architects, we design and create in 3 dimensions. I mean, we're now, most of our work is done in BIM. We don't produce 2-dimensional stuff anymore, except for planning applications. You know, we have to convert a 3D model into a 2D set of plans and elevations to submit with a planning for a planning application. In our towns and cities, I can't see why we can't have a digital model, 3-dimensional model of the town or the place, into which it's a requirement that you actually drop your own model of your proposal that can be viewed from all angles in an interactive way. We have the technology to do that now, and I can't see why we shouldn't be able to do that in places like Nottingham, for example. More difficult in the sort of smaller settlements. But being able to communicate in 3 dimensions, far better than doing it in plans, elevations and sections.
And do you see much coming from within REBA at a higher level as to pushing for that kind of integration into the system?
I think there are plans, not through REBA, but there are plans at the moment underway to try and digitise some of the major towns and cities in the UK. But it would need to become part of it would need to become a statutory part of the planning system that you are obliged to submit information in that 3-dimensional form for it to really be effective. I mean, there are places, where was I on holiday some years ago? It actually was in Malaysia, but there was a huge model of Kuala Lumpur that you could visit, a physical model. That could all be digitalized now and be part of the planning system.
You mentioned in your opening talk that there was no, rightfully, that there's no legislation requiring anybody to employ us, despite the various laws attributable to the role of architect. Is that anything, do you see any movement in that direction? Is there any kind of pressure from the top, as Jamie mentioned before in another context, looking at, you know, mandatory appointment of professionals?
Well, ARB and RB are working jointly on this because there is, from government, concern about the standards and quality of construction in the UK. And when I qualified as an architect, just about everything we did in the firm I worked for was traditionally procured, and we were inspecting the works and certifying the work as it was being built for quality and compliance, and then we issued a final certificate, and that final certificate is conclusive proof that the building has been built in accordance with proper standards and so forth. And if it burnt down in a fire, you know, it was your fault. With the advent of D&B now, who is actually monitoring the quality of what's getting built? And I'm sorry to say this, but in a way, what's the point of planning? Because nothing, absolutely nothing, gets built in accordance with its planning consent. Nothing does. And you know, things get changed and modified, and there's nobody there policing it. One of the points I'd make is that I'm a strong believer, and it was mentioned by one of the panelists earlier, about seeing more connectivity between planning and building control and building regs. We ought to consider in the UK having a single sort of type approval system for development, where you get an initial consent, maybe in principle consent, then a detailed planning consent, then another level of permission, which is effectively building control, and then a final certificate. a final completion certificate which says, yes, it meets the standards and it complies with its regional planning function. I think that would be a definite improvement.
Yeah, Paul, I just really want to pick up this point about the digital model and the information that's required to submit a planning application. I think you have to be very careful here. I accept and I agree that, if we could drop a design into a 3D model and we could see it from all sides and everybody could understand it, that's all fine and dandy, but who's going to prepare that level of detail, that amount of information for that to take place? The planning system was always for ordinary people to get involved in development themselves, to allow ordinary people to develop schemes to help them and their families. And if we get to the point where it's so technical that that is impossible to do, then really we are excluding people from that process. And I think that's a very thing we have to be very careful about. The reason why quite often planning departments do not have good schemes in front of them is a lot of the schemes are done, as I say, by people without the skills who want to do things for themselves, who want to change their environment. And if we exclude them from that process, or we're not able to help them to deliver the quality that we want, then we're missing a trick. And I think we have to be very careful to impose our standards on everybody. Well, so standards are things we want to see. We have to, if we're going to do that, we have to provide the mechanism to allow other people and the people in general to achieve those standards. And that may mean supporting people in preparing applications to the standard that's necessary, but not penalising them in cost or other grounds to prevent them from doing it in the first place. If you do that, you're going to end up with a few people doing some very fancy and clever things, but a lot of people being excluded from the system altogether. And that will then lead to people developing without the permissions or the requirements that are there in the first place. So I think you have to be very careful about that.
Yeah, it raises a good point that also points back towards issues already that exist with accessibility and participation. And if you then remove, or there's the abolition of the duty to cooperate, then that further compounds that and grows a gap of inequality. Even further.
50% of NCH tenants, social housing tenants in Nottingham, have no broadband at the moment. So, talking about deprivation, talking about disability. So how are we going to ensure, if we digitalize everything, how are we going to ensure that those groups have the ability to engage and interact with the planning system? So yes, let's simplify the planning system, but let's also democratize it. Let's make it more inclusive to people of protected characteristics.
The Nottingham has got one of the lowest average household incomes of any city in the UK, and you'd have to ask, therefore, what would a proposal like this do for that? But equally at the same time, how does Nottingham provide housing to the numbers required? Linda, you two touched upon housing and housing targets not being met, or even if approvals are granted, they're not developed upon. What is there within this, if anything, that would enable perhaps an expedited development of affordable housing?
Well, I mean, you're right that Nottingham, I think some work done by the Office of Statistics said that Nottingham citizens had the lowest level of one of the lowest levels of disposable income. And as I said, digital exclusion, was hit as hard as far as children having to work from, doing their schoolwork from home and so on. I mean, as far as working, to address deprivation and, part of the issue is that rents in Nottingham and house prices in Nottingham are actually, it's one of the sort of boom areas of where prices and rents are rising faster than in other parts of the country. And it's because of the housing supply shortage. But as I say, what we really need is an emphasis by the government to build the homes that people in low-income deprived areas actually, they actually need to live. And I, as the housing portfolio holder, I receive lots of distress calls, really, from families with children who've been served a Section 21 eviction notice because their landlords put their rent up, they can't afford the rent, they've gone into arrears, and they're about to be made homeless. It costs about £2,000 to move home. I've had people who've had to move home 6 times with their children over the last 8 years. They have no security. Their children, they have to cross the city from one side of the other because there's no school places in the place that they've had to move to. And the costs of homelessness provision in the city are something that we're constantly having to try to keep a lid on as a city. But as I said, what we really need, first of all, a bit more, if we have to sell our council houses, at least give us the funding to replace them like for like. I noticed in the latest right to buy reforms, they're saying that they will cap the number of homes that we can acquire. So at the moment we have the right to buy back properties, and within 10 years we get first options on any buybacks of any council houses, but that will be limited in the future. Now they actually are the best value houses. We would really like powers to deal with the number of empty properties within the city as well. So we have no powers at all. If a landlord wants to keep their property empty, I don't know why you would want to buy a property and then see it go into decline, but the number of empty properties in the city has increased, and we do what we can. We offer to actually provide a tenant for those landlords. We offer to manage the property for them. And then if they don't actually get a tenant into their property and leave it void, we ramp up the council tax by 200-300% year on, as time goes on, to try and persuade them to do that. So actually this point about, bringing back homes into use, but converting office space over to residential accommodation is not necessarily the answer either, because we've had to set up a joint audit and inspection team to do fire safety checking of multiple occupancy buildings within our city. And the findings are not good as far as fire stopping is concerned, as far as ongoing fire safety management of these buildings as well. And permitted development conversions are some of the worst examples that we find. So I just feel that there are levers that the government could give us, funding levers, and more powers to bring back empty homes into use. And, hoping the building safety regulations will address some of the fundamental design issues that have crept into some of the new builds, particularly for purpose-built student accommodation, design problems where clearly fire safety has fallen by the wayside. And I think Grenfell hopefully has turned the government's mind to the actual whole process of procuring and constructing and signing off of buildings as far as fire safety is concerned.
David, you talked a bit about the kind of motives potentially behind an initiative like this, and there are some fairly there's bits that don't quite join up effectively. If we kind of all understand or can see clearly that the traditional planning workflow as we know it would be swapped out for these kind of systems that we were covering earlier, who is in charge? Who's taking those decisions? Who is it then? What does that look like? Like what kind of an organization is kind of dictating one way or the other, and would there be any accountability or transparency from that? Do you have an idea or a sense as to what that would look like?
And I look a lot at planning, but it's not my specialism. I understand that a lot of it would go closer to the Republic of Ireland model, where essentially the elected members would have a lot more to do with saying where things got built. And thereafter, in the Republic of Ireland, the members are effectively removed from the system, and the officers effectively take over the delegated power structure we would have for smaller applications. The difference, I think, with the strategy that's being proposed in the planning white paper is that by using digitized systems, we wouldn't necessarily need many officers. So, it looks to me almost like a kind of cost-cutting exercise to get around the fact that for maybe many of the last few years, we've had a lot of discussion around, do we actually have a planning system that works? Because not resourced well enough to work. And I think the solution perhaps has now been proposed, which is essentially get rid of the skills base and replace it with computers that match provably popular designs. And it'll work like facial recognition software. You know, you look at your iPhone, if your face doesn't look that crumpled and you haven't had that wild a night out, it'll open up, kind of thing. You know, and I think that's very much the kind of strategy that they've got, that if the design looks roughly like what they think it should look like, then why would you need an officer to rule on it? I just don't see how you put half this stuff into a digital program, though. I think there's I still think that some of this is sort of a blue sky thinking. We could be there in 30 years' time. I just don't think we're anywhere near this complexity of what would be needed and the nuances that planning officers can bring to it at the moment. I would say one thing, I just want to raise one significant question. The people who are really driving this have been behind a series of other initiatives in the last couple of decades. And the first one was the reduction of housing benefit that led to what's currently known as the bedroom tax. Another one was the reduction in protection for employees that led to what we now call 0-hour contracts. You know, and this is almost like sort of the third or the fourth initiative, which seems to be very much a sort of small state, low tax agenda. It's got very little to do with quality of life issues. It's got a lot more to do with reducing the tax burden on those who get well paid.
Philip?
Yeah, it's following on from that. I mean, we get periodic increases in the planning application fees, and I remember when I qualified many years ago, there were no planning application fees. You can make a planning application, it didn't cost anything at all. And fees then get introduced and the system starts to get worse. And then every time we get a fee increase, we're consulted, the IBA consulted for opinions. And the general view of IBA is, look, there's no problem in paying a fee. In fact, most clients are willing, more than willing to pay the fees, provided they get a service. But it seems that every time the fees go up, the service gets worse. And now we've got a system which is dysfunctional, it's slow, it's over-bureaucratic, it's expensive. And are we actually creating a better environment than we did 20, 30 years ago when costs were much lower? So I don't quite understand this issue that it's so expensive. I mean, we were funding it before we had fees.
Could I mean, I'll just say from a local government point of view, since 2010, Nottingham has lost 150, I think it's now 170 million pounds per year in funding. And as a result of that, we've had to make 270 million pounds worth of savings. And that is not conducive to, you know, as far as our planning department is concerned. Our planning department was actually rationalised at the time of the 2008 global financial crash. We rationalised the team down because of the decrease in demand for services at that time. And since then, although the work has increased, we haven't increased the size of that team. So some of the work is like working smarter and digitising as much as we can. And I think in Nottingham, we actually do quite a lot more than many other local authorities as far as putting everything out there on the system and having as much done online as is possible, but staying within the planning laws. But you just can't get away from the massive defunding of local government, and that is bound to have ultimately, you know, we can be squeezed till the pip squeaks, frankly. You just can't get blood out of a stone. So if they do, you know, there are huge resource implications that we are trying to get our head around for both this, for the new building safety bill, for the new fire safety bill that's coming through as well, which is going to have designated building managers and accountable, responsible persons as well. There's a huge amount of legislation coming down, but there's not a great deal about what resources are going to be made available to actually do this. And certainly as far as the local plan is concerned, you know, that can take 2 years in the preparation. So, like, I'm not sure how, you know, if that's going to be an enhanced process, how you actually condense it down to 30 months without extra additional resource. So these are unanswered questions that I think we're still baffled as to how we're going to meet that resourcing challenge in relation to all of the new legend. We've got the social housing white paper coming down as well, giving tenants an enhanced voice in the say of their buildings and their management as well. All sorts of things happening, and nothing yet about how that's going to be financed.
Jonathan?
Yeah, just really to pick up on Philip's point, I mean, when I first got into planning, there were no planning fees. You've got to remember the planning system imposes restrictions on people's liberty to build where they want, when they want, and how they want. And therefore, on that, the state should provide a free service. That was the old ethos, and one that really I think had got lost when planning fees were introduced, because at the end of the day, the planning system is there for the, you know, for the community. It's there to try to balance the various needs that there are in the community, and therefore that system should be one that's paid for by the state. It's controlled by the state, should be paid for by the state, and unfortunately that sort of ethos seems to have long disappeared. And I don't think jacking up the planning fees is really the way to do this. I think resourcing, as Linda has said, is a better way to go. We need to resource planning properly. We need to use taxpayers' money, not try and make planning a self-funded system. You know, you're always going to be going nowhere if you try and go down that road, because the government will then introduce more permitted development to try and sort of ease the situation because costs are getting up higher. And what do you end up with then? The planning team having to deal with forms of development for which they're not getting properly paid. So, you know, it is a very difficult route to go down, and one that we really should have a rethink over. Local government needs to be properly resourced. It needs to have the funding going in. And if we have to pay more tax to do it, then that's the price we should pay.
What kind of scenario would you envision in practice for the average architect if they're having to implement or interface with a planning system that would have to implement such a set of parameters?
Big question. I think to start with, I'd say the service and the amount of time you actually engage with a planning consultant against their fees is actually very good value for money, and the response you get from it and working with them, I think it's money well spent. Likewise with building control, and I feel like then there definitely needs to be more resource allocation. And I think the issue I find is that with planning applications, the frustration comes down to timing more than actually the cost of the application. And if you pay for an application, you want a service. Well, I'd say on 50% of my schemes, you don't hear anything back from planners until 4 or 5 weeks into an 8-week process. And if you want to get, I think, society and clients on board and encouraged by the whole planning process, what you want to see is a bit more early engagement. And instead of having a sort of ping pong tournament of toing and throwing with comments and suggestions, you'd like to see a bit more engagement up front and design development together. So I don't feel like fees are an issue. I feel like it's time and quality of service with planners, which I think is obviously is down to resource allocation as well. And I feel for them, and you constantly see that local authority planning officers are stretched beyond their means, and they're juggling far too many, in most cases, I think far too many projects at once without having to put the time into it, to work with you. And we just had a bad point. If you can find a way of cutting out administrative processes and the costs associated with that, then maybe it's a case that money can actually be better spent on dealing with the issues with design and with planning, with sustainability, placemaking, etc. That's what I said, I think, earlier in my white paper discussion, was streamline the administration process, and let's see if we can use that money more effectively.
David, what are your thoughts on the outlook for those that are in the architectural profession that are interfacing with planners on a regular basis and ultimately making a living out of that service for their clients? Like how would this proposal impact upon pre-existing workflows and prospect of more or less work for architects?
But I think the architect, as opposed to the architectural technician, I think the architect faces a challenge, because clearly architects are doing a lot of work that is invariably starting from scratch, piece of white paper, start drawing on it, taking on board all the site constraints, opportunities, and so on. Moving a lot of this stuff towards some kind of digital recognition software that says, yes, that's the right kind of design, or that's not the right kind of design, does actually mean that a lot of those skills around innovation or responding to, say, climate change in particular, will not be so much in demand. I would imagine you could see a position where lots of architectural commissions went to architectural technicians because they were far more able to replicate what had been built before at the kind of cost base that most developers would prefer to pay.
Zara, you've been on our chat box and Q&A. Do you want to begin bringing forward any comments or questions to our panelists?
Yes, absolutely. I've got a question for you, if you don't mind. First of all, thank you very much for your insights. I found this discussion very interesting. And a common theme for me was that it seems that there's a big gap in understanding what good design really is at all scales. And that's by the government, but also by other people. As Laura was saying, it seems that the quality of what is submitted to planning is very low. So I think there's a big gap in design, including community involvement. And my question was, how can we include the community more? How can we go back to the basics of design? In architecture, we study that the community involvement needs to be right at the start, while you are working on the brief, and not just after your design is finished and you want people to comment on it. In your opinion, how can we include the community more and go back to these basics, and maybe also have a look at the Scandinavian models of community involvements, and include those in our planning process? I don't know, Philip, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, so this is one of the challenges of the white paper, because the government is saying they want to front load public engagement at in that zoning process, so that public involvement comes much earlier, rather than waiting until applications are submitted in detail and then the public start complaining and saying they don't want development in this area, they don't like the look of this. But it is a problem, because people just don't get involved until even just the consultations. I mean, we've had a number of consultations recently on CIL, community infrastructure levy charges with local authorities, and no one seems to bother to contribute to the discussions. Very, very few. Until, of course, the CIL's been introduced, then everybody throws their arms up in the air and says, hang on a minute, how can the council possibly charge this sort of level on development? So public engagement is a real problem, and particularly engaging with those more or sort of more disadvantaged in society, younger people, people who are disabled, people who haven't got, as mentioned earlier, access to digital platforms. We have in our neck of the woods near Oxford huge opposition to development, and yet the average age of the average first-time buyer in Oxford is 45 years old. So if you want to live in Oxford City, you can't find a place. It's very expensive. If you could communicate with those under say 40 and get their involvement into planning and said, look, do you think we should release more land for housing? They'd be unanimous, yes. So I think one of the real challenges, and one I think things I hope we can achieve is much greater public involvement, particularly in those that currently don't get a say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have a couple of couple of comments and a question, and we have a comment from an anonymous attendee who says, "Could not agree more with David's point. I note from working with Wesley Persimmon and other house builders in the past, and from living in a Barrett's townhouse, house sizes from the big developers aren't designed to grow with the family, meaning there's a need to move up 2-3 times in a lifetime. I agree there are lessons to be learned from our Scandinavian counterparts who address this well. The planning algorithms that are potentially going to approve large housing schemes is my worry. Giving carte blanche to developers' internal design teams is dangerous, as they will just cram plots on a site. It's a balance of quality and quantity that needs control." I think that touches on a few points that we have discussed tonight. Would anyone like to comment on this?
I'll say something which is not, an answer to that, because I think everything in that sort of comment there almost deals with it itself. I would say that I think there's an agenda as well with this idea, I think, of the system, that it ought to allow less risk in the system and thereby enable other people to come forward and build things. Now, if that were possible, I think that would be great. If that was what the result was, I think that is being touted as a possible result. I'm just not convinced, though, that if you sort of say, well, you're a small builder, you've hardly got any money in the bank, you cannot afford to put 18 months of your working capital locked up in a site with the possibility you may not get a planning approval. If you go to our system, all you've got to do is show us a picture of what we say you're allowed to build, and you can have a green light within half an hour. I think that, that's the kind of trading offer that this planning white paper makes. But I still don't know whether that's going to deal with the fact. I think what we need more than anything else at the moment is a significant rethinking of what our house types are, because the types that will go into the provably popular portfolio of approved types will be the things that were built 50, 60 years ago, with things like garage blocks to the left of them, when they should have things like CHP blocks. It doesn't strike me that there's anything in the planning white paper about how do we make this jump, and then after we've made that jump, how do we then get more of that? It's more about how do we make everything look like 1870 again?
Yeah, that's really unfortunate. Yeah. Sorry, Linda, did you have your hand up? I missed that while we were talking about community engagement.
Yeah, I was musing on the fact that when we receive sort of huge numbers of responses to planning applications, that it generally comes from people who are very middle class, very good at advocating for themselves. And I was hoping that Laura was going to jump in and tell us about the urban room on Carrington Street. And I think there's more that could be done, actually taking plans to local schools where you get normal, normal non-middle class parents and children looking at design guides. But I think I just wanted Laura to sort of go over the urban room and the whole concept of it, which might be a vehicle by which you could actually improve consultation in local plans generally.
Thanks, Linda. Yes, thankfully we do have an urban room in Nottingham, and it's one of the vehicles we use as a forum. It's a neutral forum. NDSA, RIBA, the City Council, both universities, and a lot of other organizations, Historic England, they formed a partnership. And we now have this room, which is both a physical and a virtual thing, where people can go and comment and talk and debate and come up with ideas. It has a website, you can go and look at what we're doing there. But essentially, I think the model of the urban room, why it's working well at the moment, and it's been working for the past 2 years really exceptionally well, is that the concept is that we don't consult on a site-by-site basis or on a development-by-development basis. We simply open the dialogue of placemaking to the city as a whole, and we continue that dialogue throughout. And if a development comes along, and if a site becomes available, there is that platform, there are the networks, there's the partnerships, there's people who know where to go, and all of that infrastructure, which is a social infrastructure as well as a physical and virtual one, is there to establish a dialogue, and the dialogue is continuous, rather than just go and let's look at this particular model of house. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about what things look like in the urban room. We're talking about what can we do to have a better Nottingham in all sense. Do we need to plant more trees? Do we need to grow more food in the city? All sorts of different things. It's not necessarily about the building either. It's about what kind of life we want to live. And I think that's the way to engage, personally.
That's so important. And it's so important to have that one place where the people know they can go to have that engagement. Yeah, and I truly believe that the engagement needs to be done very early on, not just after everything is done. Okay, it's done, it's submitted, and everything is, 3D models are ready and everything is done. It really needs to be, participation rather than just comment. We have another question from an anonymous attendee as well, who says, quality of architecture is a concern. I recall from attending another white paper event, an RBA local branch member mentioned Bath, where he practiced. There are areas in the country where the white paper proposal just won't work like Bath, because we want to protect the historic fabric. That said, in neighboring Bristol, it could work. What do the panel think about this? Anybody?
Right, I'm going to go with that one. That's all right with everybody else. It's very close to my heart, this building in context and protecting our fabric and our assets. Yes, I don't know how to make it work. I don't know how to make it work anywhere in the country. Is my answers to that. Because if you go into historic areas, you have the issue of building in context and putting a format, a template that you repeat, which is not going to work. And if you go outside in the suburbs, you have the issue of strategic thinking, connecting networks, cycling infrastructure, transport, and then you're building, no matter what stamp you're going to put, even if everything looks the same, it's not going to deliver sustainable development. So I don't know how to make it work anywhere, to be quite frank. So I don't know. This automatization idea is really quite difficult for me to understand. The best buildings in the world from 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago till now, didn't require a computer. And we're still studying them because they are, it's not the tool, it's the user of the tool. And if we don't have the skills to apply any tool, it's going to be a disaster. That's my thinking.
Can I just add, I mean, there are lots of photographs of buildings from the early 19th century, and a lot of the literature that goes with a lot of this thinking and the general kind of campaigning around why this is what we need. But, a code that created a set of designs that have been provably popular and which were the only things that we could have going forward would have said no to Nash in 1824 when he put forward Park East Mews on the grounds it was semi-detached properties, and we don't do those. We've never seen those before. We do terraced properties. Yeah? So it's something in there that just doesn't understand how the world of development and architecture works.
But also the issues of land ownership and land value, which are completely ignored by applying the system. I simply don't understand how it could work.
Yeah. Apologies, Jonathan. I think you raised your hand while we were talking about community engagement being from the beginning. I missed that.
Yeah, only that 10, 15 years ago, there was an onus on developers to, when they're proposing proposals, to enter into community engagement before they submit a planning application. That was a regular thing. We used to do a lot of them. We used to do a lot of community engagement. We used to spend a lot of time doing sort of exhibitions, and then, you know, often having rather, we didn't do public meetings. They were an absolute disaster because all you'd become would be a, you know, somebody to hate. But exhibitions proved to be quite popular. And yeah, they were quite useful. We always learned things from those. We learned a lot more about an area. So we saw them as a positive thing, but the need for those sort of dribbled away, and therefore we rarely get involved with them anymore. But at one point, they were very much the flavour of the time and things that we were told by government we had to do, but the government sort of pulled away from that.
It's certainly less common. They still go on. I have a crutch in the wardrobe at my home. Every time I do a public consultation exercise, I put on a fake cast and go to the public consultation exercise with a crutch just to make sure I don't get headbutted.
So I put my tin hat on before I go out to some of the local planning meetings.
Right, so just one final comment from Mick from our committee. He said that we have recently had a scheme where we paid for the council's conservation and urban designers' time to find out week 8 the urban designer on the case had changed. And sorry, we are now in limbo and we have a frustrated client.
Well, that's one of the downsides of this current system, that you can have an individual come in with a completely different set of priorities.
Yeah,
I think we've all been there. We've all been there. We try our best to work in consultation, and you know, we've been in situations where we have entered into planning performance agreements and we've paid significant sums of money, and you develop a scheme design and you get it through to a point where it's ready to go in for formal application, it gets registered, and then a different officer's allocated to it. And it's almost like going back to square one all over again and having to explain the rationale behind where you've got to. Yeah, it's really frustrating.
I'm happy to look into that if Michael wants to send me the details. I don't know the circumstances behind it though, but I will check it out.
Sarah, we have this problem too, but what we try and do is to, you know, understand the planning authorities enough to get an idea of who's likely to stay, who's, you know, to know the people. If you know the people, then you've got a better chance of understanding, you know, if these sorts of situations are going to happen. But in a situation like that, we'd probably go to the head of planning to discuss why before we get to a decision, because at that point, you know, it gets very difficult. So we would try to intervene early, talk to the head of planning or somebody more senior in order to try and resolve the issue.
Yeah, Laura.
I just wanted to make a comment. I was going to ask Michael if it was in Nottingham, but apparently no, it wasn't. It was an East Midlands scheme. I assumed that means that it wasn't in Nottingham. I was very surprised because there is somewhere in between. You don't have to codify absolutely everything, but you can set a specific criteria that all urban designers and all planners and everybody in the team knows what is it that you're aiming for, what's the threshold of design, and what are the criteria that you're going to evaluate. It doesn't necessarily tell you it should be red brick or it should be, but it tells you it should be, this is how you look at quality. That's what we did in the design quality framework, and I would be surprised if we are not by now achieving some sort of consistency, because we have sort of a platform where replies now should be consistent. So there are ways to do it without specifying what to do.
I mean, Laura, just to say, I mean, some smaller local planning authorities you do tend to find that there are the odd conservation officer in particular who is you know, got a particular set of views, and you know, that the other planning officers feel hidebound to do what they ask. So sometimes we do find ourselves having to try and convince conservation and design officers of specific benefits of schemes when we know we have the support of the planning team, but not them.
I've been there. I've been there. I've only been in the local authority for 2 years before I was in practice, so I know what you mean. Yes.
All right, final question is by Thomas Glenn, and who said, how would the proposals deal with the huge amount of energy efficiency retrofit needed to address climate change, measures such as external insulation, etc.? Yeah, I think that is a problem that the white paper doesn't really address those problems. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess that's the answer, Thomas.
I think in Nottingham City Homes, we've got 4,500 homes that are not EPC C level. So that's you know, our next challenge that we're trying to look at. And I mean, as far as retrofitting existing, as far as becoming carbon neutral, actually, I mean, the framework for new buildings is one whole challenge, but retrofitting existing buildings to make them more energy efficient, let alone carbon neutral, is the massive challenge that we face. The government is putting lots of grant money out there, and we've been very successful in securing that. But some of the issues that we have are a lot of the retrofit technologies are very new. They come with penalties at the end if they're not carbon neutral as well. And some of there's a bit of a almost like a skill shortage. It's all very innovative at the minute. And I just think that there's a lot of progress to be made about retrofit schemes and how they, you know, how they'll actually become more affordable. Because I think at the moment you're looking at about £20,000 per residential property. And I think that comes to something like £31.5 billion to retrofit all the properties in the country. And that's the costs estimated as of now. Yeah, it's a great question that I wish I knew the answer to, but it's something we turn our minds to in the City Council, because we're trying to do carbon neutral 22 years early, and we think there's a climate emergency and that we need more urgent action way before 2050.
Absolutely.
Compared to the cost of the pandemic, 31 billion doesn't sound very much, does it?
Piece of software.
The same software you use to fix borders. We'll run through the poll results. I think some interesting development there. The final count has come in, and we only have 14% undecided, and the split for and against has gone 68% against the white paper and 18% generally for. So we've had a massive swing of views over the course of the discussion. So thanks for that. Thanks everybody who's joined us this evening. It was a bit of a long one. This is a complex subject. I'm sure we've, in some aspects, some regards, we've barely scratched the surface of some aspects of it. But for those areas that you've all delved into tonight, thank you for bringing your insight, expertise and time to better inform ourselves and our membership groups and others that are interested in this area. And keep an eye on our social media platforms and correspondences for further updates about the work that we're doing further down the line. And hopefully we'll see all of you again with us soon.